Hey and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So today I'd like to go over exactly how threat works on the Paladin Justicar. I'd also like to go over exactly how these rings with the charging bull effect work, where you run and generate threat around you. I'd also like to compare whether or not you should be using the Mythallar set or the Neverwinter dual set with teamwork tactics to gain the most threat. You can see one gives 15% and the other one just gives an additional hit when you deal combat advantage damage. Which is better? Now I'll go over all these things and there'll be timestamps in the video description below and the play bar, so you can feel free to skip to any section you're most interested in. Now as a role as a tank, your main objective is to make sure that the enemies are attacking you and not your allies, and then be able to actually take those hits without dying. And of course having a healer to back you up. So how does this actual threat system work? We can see, for example, on Oathstrike we have increased threat as an added effect. We have the same on Templar's Wrath, and if we take a feat here, Sacred Shield, we can also make our Sacred Weapon encounter also have increased threat. What do these things actually mean, and what do you need to be using then in order to make sure, to the best of your capabilities, that the enemies are attacking you and not your allies? And I believe with a bit of understanding, it can go a long way to making you a much better tank. So before we get started, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of these channel members for the added extra support. So let's jump into it. Now, testing out threat in Neverwinter doesn't come easy. You generally need a friend to help you out. And a big thing to help you out as a tank is to watch this meter here. You can see this is like our threat bubble. It's a little bar, very tiny, and if we summon a companion and we go and let's say attack this dummy, our companion will start attacking the dummy, and after a certain amount of time we can see that the companion deals enough damage that he actually takes the threat from me. So if we now look at this bubble, we can see that we are not high on our current target's threat list. That's because the companion has dealt far more damage than I have done to this target. You can see we jump up now a bit, and now we are red, which means we were on the top. But Githyanki has done a bit more damage, and now we're just fairly high on our current target's threat list. We can do some more damage, try and outbeat him again. We get again to red, and we can see we are our current target's highest priority. And this is very beneficial for a tank. We've popped down to orange, we're very high now. And as a tank, if you're not red when you look at a target, then you're not doing your job properly. Now, albeit in AoE fights, it can be very challenging to make sure that you're having that threat against all of those enemies. And that's why you would use things like Templar's Wrath, where you would hit everybody around you with increased threat. So now we can see that straight up, just by dealing more damage, we can get the aggro on this dummy over our companion. And that's the general basics of threat. Whoever has dealt the most damage to the target is that enemy's priority. So this dummy would attack me if it could because I've dealt the most damage. So first of all, let's go over these powers that have added effect of increased threat. And lastly, we'll go over powers like Vow of Enmity, which places on top of the threat list. We also have that with Smite with Divine Challenger. So, Oath of Protection. What does this mean, increased threat? And why should I take it over something that, let's say, has higher magnitude, which would then deal higher damage? Well, what it means is that effectively your damage will be multiplied by a hidden number. And this is this increased threat. And that number for Oathstrike is times 8. So if we were to look at Oathstrike and multiply its magnitude by 8, we would end up with 200 magnitude listed here. So then you would need to compare that with your other at-wills, and we can see no other at-will has 200 magnitude. So the best one for dealing damage then for threat is Oathstrike. Then you would go to your encounter powers like Templar's Wrath. It has 400 magnitude with increased threat. Now, why would I use it over, let's say, Bane, which has 620 magnitude? Well, because of that increased threat. Again, for Templar's Wrath, that is a multiplier of 8. So in actual fact, Templar's Wrath has 3200 magnitude. Yeah, you have no other encounter power that has that high of an effective magnitude. Again, I like to express, you're not actually dealing that much damage. Your target thinks you are. and that's all that matters with regards to making sure they're attacking you and not your allies. Additionally, if you go and take this Sacred Shield feat, you will make it so that your Sacred Weapon here will have increased threat. What this means is that your damage done by Sacred Weapon will be multiplied by 4. So in actual fact, every time you attack, then you're dealing an extra 208 magnitude damage. So then if we're swinging our at-will, we're already getting 200 magnitude damage from Oath Strike. We add another 208 from Sacred Weapon, and that's really good. Albeit it only lasts 10 seconds and then the cooldown is 25 seconds. So it's very helpful for maintaining threat over time, since you just use that and then you swing your at-will and you end up with a butt ton of threat. We can easily jump up to top threat list on this dummy over our companion. No problem. If we look through the rest of our abilities, we can see none of them have other increased threats benefits. There is a possibility that tanks could have a mix between healing and tanking, and thus we would use Divine Replication. Unfortunately, this actually reduces the threat we generate with our heals from Divine Touch, and so right now it's bugged. Hopefully it can get fixed in the future, but it's not something I can test with these dummies so easily. People have tested it and yes, they've said it's broken. Hopefully that gets fixed. I'll do more in-depth testing on it when it does, and we can see what happens. Otherwise, lastly, we have Intimidating Presence, which says it will greatly increase the threat we generate. And this is our tab ability, and you're sacrificing a lot of survivability by taking these Angel Wings instead of just using Unyielding Champion, which would mean that we can block up to 6% of our maximum hit points and also automatically block attacks. But with these Angel Wings, supposedly when you attack, you would have increased threat. You would deal more effective damage, so the target would think you deal more damage. Unfortunately, it actually reduces the threat we generate by 10%, which is a joke. Lastly, we have a global threat modifier, which is Oath of Protection, which says it increases threat generation point. That's it. That means anytime we attack, no matter what power we use, it will have increased threat. Basically, what it means is that all the damage we deal is multiplied by a certain amount. For example, if I were to take Valorous Strike, I just deal damage with it, and its damage is affected by Oath of Protection. Everything is, and I'll go over what it means for, like, say, Oath Strike or Templar's Wrath. So we have 60 magnitude, and with Oath of Protection, we multiply that by 5.5. Many of you will have red flags going off. Wait a second. Yes, 5.5. They seem to have reduced it from what it was previously. But with that aside, this means that Valorous Strike effectively has 330 magnitude. If we go use that with Oath Strike, which has times 8, this effectively being 200 magnitude, you indeed just multiply all of that by 5.5. That's 200 by 5.5. Effectively, you have an at-will with 1100 magnitude. And that is why it's pretty highly effective to use an at-will which deals next to no damage to hold aggro against your DPS counterparts. But we all know it's not enough. And that is because our offensive stats are abysmal compared to our DPS counterparts. We can see that here on, let's say, my tank build. And these are the kind of offensive stats you're looking at. DPS will generally have 90% on at least 4 of those stats. Along with that, DPS get a boost to their base damage, which is, again, just a multiplier to all their outgoing damage of an additional 20%, which means, again, they can just deal more damage than us. So lastly, let's go into those powers that place us on top of the threat list. Now, these powers can be very questionable whether they're actually worth using. And in my opinion, I only have one as an emergency backup. And what I mean by that is if I die, my aggro gets reset to nothing. And then you will need something. You will need a power to put you on top of the threat list ASAP so that all your other party members aren't just getting annihilated by the boss. Now, if you are running in content like a trial where you need to have tank switches, then you need to be running with Smite, with Divine Challenger. to be able to take the aggro back when you need to, especially if you're running with two bosses where you need to tank one and then switch between them. Then you can't be running with an AoE hard taunt that would place you on top of the threat list. However, what it means is that when we go and let's say summon a companion, we'll move to a new target, we'll attack this one, again just with Valorous Strike, so he at least has a chance to take the aggro from us. So he goes and does his spinning strike there, and we can see we're below now. We're gone way down in the green sector. But if we use this power, which places us on top of the threat list, we can see we immediately jump to red. But it won't actually take this companion very long to actually get ahead of us. And that is because nobody has actually dealt a lot of damage to this dummy. And what these top of the threat list powers do is indeed place you on top of the threat list. But for how long, you may ask? Well, only 10% above the damage that has been dealt to the target. For example, if somebody's done 10 million damage to this dummy, I use one of these top of the threat list powers, I will be placed at 11 million damage done to the target. Now this means that these powers get better and better the longer, let's say, a boss fight goes on. So at the very beginning of the boss fight, let's say I run in and I use a hard taunt. I use my Vow of Enmity or my Smite with Divine Challenger. Well, what happens? If nobody's dealt any damage to the target, I'm placed 10% above the total damage dealt to the enemy. And if, let's say, I've done 100 damage, then I'll be placed 10% above that at 110. And that's it. Soon as somebody goes and hits with a little at-will, does 1,000 damage, they've already taken aggro from you. That's why these top of the threat list powers are goddamn terrible at the beginning of the fight, because you need people to have done lots of damage to the target for them to become effective. You can see again, if somebody's done 100 million damage to a target, places me 10% above them with my Vow or Smite, then I've effectively done 10 million damage above anybody else. Again, this is all effective damage. This is what the target thinks you have done, not what you actually do. And that's what makes the difference between a tank and a DPS. Effectively allows us to make the target think we've done more damage than a DPS, so they focus us rather than the DPS. So overall, you can see a chart here of the different threat powers on the Paladin and the threat multipliers. And that just means you're multiplying the damage from Oath Strike by 8, or Sacred Shield, this is the feat that you need for Sacred Weapon, by 4, or Templar's Wrath by 8. Intimidating Presence by 0.9, that means you're reducing your threat by 10%. It's a bit of a joke, don't understand why it's like that. And otherwise for Oath of Protection, which is like our global modifier, we have 5.5. And you can see a bunch of my testings here. We get 5.5 for the Oath of Protection global modifier. We get 8 for Oath Strike. We also get 8 for Templar's Wrath. And with Sacred Shield or Weapon, we get a 4 there. Again, that's only affecting the actual damage done by that exact Sacred Weapon, not like the at-will that triggered it. And then Intimidating Presence, we can see we've done a small test here, small amount of damage, just one hit from Valorous Strike, and we can see pretty much no effect from Intimidating Presence, which led me having to do a much higher damage test. So then I attacked with my Valorous Strike, you can see 20 times there to get 141,000 damage. This is with Intimidating Presence active the whole time, and we can see that in actual fact it reduced the amount of threat I generated. If we took out the 0.9, then we would be higher than the damage dealt. Now, I can explain how these tests were done later on, but you can see the last time I went and tested aggro on a Paladin, we were getting Sacred Weapon to have a 3, we were getting Intimidating Presence to at least give us 30% more threat, and Oath of Protection was a 9. So that's gone from 9 down to a 5.5. That does make it significantly harder to hold aggro, and so you're going to have to be on top of your game. I've gone over how I hold aggro in those dragon hunts, and the way I usually do it is I slot Templar's Wrath, Vow, and my Binding Oath. And at the beginning of the fight, you want to call like artifacts, and you want to use that Templar's Wrath as much as you can, along with your daily power combined with your Manticore's Bane Bite from that new headpiece. And that's generally how I would hold aggro at the beginning, because you want to stack up that effective damage yourself rather than using top of the threat list powers, which relies on your allies dealing lots of damage and can be very easy to mistime it, and they end up taking the aggro from you and getting hit and dying. So let's move on to the Charging Bull rings. So we have the new ring, the Stalwart Needle of Celerity, and we have the older ring, the Ring of the Condemned. And you can indeed actually use both of them. You can have them both slotted. Now, what they give you is when you've been running for 1 second, you can see the icon on the top left there, this ring effect. And that means I have that Charging Bull active, which means I'm generating threat around me as I move. And this is very good for gaining aggro against multiple targets without actually needing to attack them whatsoever, because all we have in terms of AoE damage is a few Templar's Wraths. You could use Bane as well. Just keep in mind they're all using Divinity, so you could use Templar's Wrath 3 times, or you could use Bane 3 times. And we all know now Templar's Wrath is much better because its magnitude is over 3,000 with this increased threat, whereas Bane's only 620. So you would have the ability to cast like Templar's Wrath 3 times, but then you're out. And let's say you're in a long AoE fight where you can't regenerate Divinity so quickly. You need something else to grab the attention of enemies, and sure, you could go around and hit them with Oath Strike, and it does have an AoE effect. If you're between 2 targets like this, you can see you can hit both of them. But the problem is I'm not gaining attention of this guy or that guy, and sometimes it can be just easier to have one of these rings. You could have 2 of the rings. Do they work together? No, they don't. Now, the way the rings work, very simply, is that when you walk around, base damage you will deal is 20,000 every half second to these targets as you are running with this effect up. So every second you deal 40,000 damage. Now, because you're a tank and you have a global modifier, this actually gets increased by times 7. I am not sure why it's times 7, but it means you're dealing 140,000 damage every half second to those targets that are within range of you. What is that range, you say? Well, it's just 15 feet. It's the same radius you have of our Bane. You can see if we stand in the middle, our target's at the edge of the circle, then they will gain the effect of my ring when they're that distance from you, which is not bad at all. If you're running by the enemies, you only have to go that close and they will get hit by your ring. Yes, it's effectively like you're dealing damage to them every half second. Again, these are my tests and you can see my testing data just here. I went through a whole mess of stuff thinking that perhaps it was being affected by our different offensive stats. Apparently no, because I was always getting on average like 140,000 damage needed to be done to the dummy before I would take aggro. And this is using a different character. You can see 140,000, and then we're also getting around 280 all the time. 280. And this is because of those 2 hits you'd get within 1 second. I was doing it as soon as the icon would pop up, and so that would be effectively 1 second. But because that's 1 second, you're getting 2 hits in a second, and so you were getting always 280 pretty much consistently. 280, and then like 140. 280, 140, and this was just puzzling me, and I was wondering, was it critting or not critting? Was it deflecting or not deflecting? And so I went to test it then on a healer, and we were consistently getting like 40, and then we were also getting 20 sometimes, 40, and then testing on a healer for 10 seconds. I think I didn't run around very well, but we got like 280 damage, which is odd. And if we do some math, you could see it's like, let's say 6 hits of 20 and 4 hits of 40. Maybe we got a crit there. But in actual fact, it was because I wasn't running particularly well and we were only getting 14 hits of 20. And we could see our next 10-second test, we were getting much higher results, and that led me to believe that it was 19 hits of 20,000. And so that's what I ended up summing it up as. And it's the same with the Ring of Condemned. It's 20k per hit twice a second. And then do they stack? I used both of them, did multiple tests, and we can see you're still just getting 40,000. Again, that's 2 hits within that 1 second. And so ultimately just use one of these rings, no need to use two. And what will happen is that you will deal 20,000 damage every half second. So 40,000 damage in 1 second, but that's multiplied by like 7 for tanks. At least on a Paladin it's multiplied by 7, so you're dealing 140,000 every half second. 280,000 damage in 1 second, which is not bad when you look at DPS who have at-wills and AoE powers, and usually they don't hit for more than 200,000, 300,000 in an AoE fight. So you can generally easily keep on top of the threat of those enemies just by running around them, and that's usually not too much trouble. And if you're running away from them and you have this active, well, they'll usually follow you because they'll be within 15 feet of you. Just keep in mind that 15 feet is pretty small, so you're going to have to make sure you're close enough to them. And that's the math that I calculated with that charging bull effect. And I hope it was somewhat insightful to you guys, because that took quite a while to get tested out. Ultimately, I want to answer the question of, should you be using the Mythallar set, or should you be using, let's say, this Teamwork Tactics set, which would give you 15% more threat? Well, I done a bunch more testing on it. And this was back when our global modifier was a 7. And I had tested it out with Valorous Strike on the Oathkeeper versus Oath Strike. We're getting a global modifier of 7 with Oath Strike of 8. And it was adding up exactly pretty much to the damage that was needed to deal to take the aggro off the dummy. And then I went and tested Mythallar, and we could see that Mythallar is indeed being affected by our global modifier. And this can be a massive help to the damage that we output. We went and tested that 15% extra aggro test, and we could see it's just additive, which is pretty abysmal since it only adds to our global modifier, doesn't multiply separately. Now what that means is that when you have the Mythallar set, and let's say every time I deal damage with combat advantage, which is what you will be doing all the time because you'll have DPS on the other side of you, then you'll deal this 100 magnitude damage, which is actually not magnitude damage, it's just your item level damage. And this is mitigated by the enemy's damage resistance, which is 33%. And so if we have just about 7,000 damage there, our hits will deal about 5,000 per hit. And then that 5,000 is multiplied by our global modifier, which is 5.5. You're effectively gaining like 25,000 effective damage per hit with the Mythallar. Where if you went and added just, let's say, 15% more threat or 15% to our Oath of Protection, then let's say our Oath Strike deals like 2,000 damage. Then with that 15% extra threat, you would be at 90,000 damage per hit. Whereas if you didn't have that 15%, you would only lose 2,000 damage and just have 88,000. With that 15% threat on your at-will, you'd go from 88,000 to 90,000 damage per hit. Whereas just adding an extra 25,000 damage per hit is a lot more efficient, wouldn't you say, than just adding 2,000. Albeit, if you're just using Templar's Wrath to spam at the beginning, it can be helpful to have 15% added to that. But if your fight goes for any length of time, you're better off just having that consistent extra damage on your Oath Strike, and you can much more easily maintain that aggro. And even better if you run along with a Ring of Darkness to reduce the enemy's accuracy, effectively increasing your deflect severity. That can even be better because the Ring of Darkness will help to get procced by your Mythallar. So again, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of my channel members for helping me keep my channel going. And if I presented this ball, consider leaving the video a like. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.